People speak about Donald Trump as though he's an anomaly. CNN's Fareed Zakaria has a video entitled Trump's Revolution in Foreign Policy. Not a compliment, of course. He attempts to make the point that Trump represents some sort of departure from America's traditional role in the world. But let's be clear, Trump is not a break from history. He's simply American empire with the mask, the gloves, and the filter off. Everything that's so shocking about his foreign policy has precedent. The main difference with Donald Trump is that number one, he says the quiet part out loud. And number two, in late stage capitalism, the empire begins to eat itself. And so the average American is beginning to feel just a little bit of what we in the global south have experienced for generations. So to I'd like to respond to Zachariah's video, in which he laments the unraveling of the so-called global order. The truth is that order was never about democracy. It was about domination. It was never about peace, it was about power. So let's go piece by piece and dismantle some of the myths in that monologue. Number one, the myth of America as a benevolent global leader. Zachariah suggests that the US has underwritten the global order for 8 decades, implying that America has been some sort of stabilizing force in the world. But let's look at what that stability has actually meant for those outside of the West. For Latin America, it meant CIA-backed coups, economic warfare, puppet regimes that served US business interests while people suffered under dictatorships. For Africa, it meant the assassination of anti-colonial leaders like Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, and under Obama, Muammar Gaddafi, while their nations face economic strangulation for seeking to break free from Western exploitation. For the Middle East, that global order meant funding and arming authoritarian regimes while waging endless wars that displaced millions. And for the Caribbean, it meant turning our economies into playgrounds for American corporations while punishing any attempt at self-determination. Just ask Haiti, Grenada, or Cuba. So when Zachariah says that the world is becoming less orderly and predictable, we have to ask, for whom? For the people whose lands have been plundered, whose governments have been overthrown, whose economies have been shackled, or for the elites who've profited off of the illusion of America as some sort of moral leadership. Second, Ukraine, a convenient betrayal. Zachariah portrays Trump's abandonment of Ukraine as shocking, as though the US has always been a trustworthy ally. But history tells a different story. The US has a long history of discarding allies once they've served their purpose. It funded the Afghan Mujahideen against the Soviets in the 1980s, only to abandon Afghanistan to warlords. It backed Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq War, only later to turn on him as a great villain of the 21st century. It once supported leaders like Manuel Noriega in Panama and Mobutu Sese Seko in Congo until they were no longer useful. So Ukraine, is it really an exception, or is it just the latest in a long line of nations that believed American promises, only to find themselves discarded when they were no longer convenient? 3. The US as a landlord seeking rent. One of the few moments of clarity in Zachariah's monologue comes from Singapore's defense minister, who describes America as moving from liberator to landlord seeking rent. This is precisely how the US foreign policy has always functioned. For Africa and Latin America, this meant the IMF and World Bank imposing crushing debt, forcing nations to hand over their resources in exchange for aid. For the Caribbean, this meant neoliberal policies that kept our islands dependent on tourism rather than developing industries of our own. And for Ukraine, it now means Washington demanding a stake in its mineral wealth as a price for its support. Trump's approach to foreign policy, where every alliance must yield financial gain, is not new. He's simply saying the quiet part out loud. So what comes next? Zachariah fears that as American power declines, the world will become more unstable. But let's turn that question around. Unstable for whom? Because for much of the global south, this post-American world is not something to fear. It might be something to build. A world where we are no longer dictated to by Washington, no longer exploited for cheap labor and raw materials, no longer forced to play by rules that were never designed for our benefit. Trump is not an aberration. He is the empire without the mask. The question is, now that the illusion has been shattered, what are we going to do with that knowledge? In the next video, I'm going to take this discussion to the Pacific, to Hawaii, where I'm right now. The islands that have been America's testing grounds for over a century. If you want to understand how the US operates, look at how it treats its territories. Stick around for part 2. Bless up.